Morning, everyone. If you are just joining, you are in evidence-based practices across the tiers for our MTSS series, Middle High School Partnership. And this is the Behavior and SEL Providers strand. We're really glad you can join us today. On behalf of the Patent MTSS initiative, my name is Erica Karuder, and I am a consultant out of the Patent Harrisburg office, serving as statewide lead for the School Psychology Initiative. I also support MTSS Mathematics and the Learning Engagement and Environment Initiative. There are a number of other patent consultants here this morning helping to facilitate. My co-presenter this morning, Dr. Drew Hunter.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Drew Hunter, patent consultant from the Harrisburg office, supporting our MTSS initiatives, our Learning Environment and Engagement Initiative, and our School Psychology Initiative. So welcome, everyone.
All right.
We also have with us,
Go ahead.
I was going to pass it off to Karen. We have Karen Brady with us this morning.
Good morning, everyone. I wanted to thank you all for joining. I am Karen Brady, and I am the Central Region MTSS lead, and I am also on the Literacy Initiative as well. I am joined by our regional lead out of the East, Donna Halpin, and also the regional lead from the West, Silky Caparelli, and also a bunch of other patent folks as well. Drew and Erica, kicking it off to you.
Okay, thanks so much. So again, welcome everybody. We will take a moment here, and as our co-hosts are helping with any questions or support that you might need throughout the session, they will be posting links to where you can find resources. So I'll just take a moment here, hopefully, and show you what those look like. So the overarching live binder for this series, they'll post the link, and the code is MTSS space ESO, all capitals. So you can find all of the handouts and resources from this entire series on here. For today specifically, we'll post the link directly to the Padlet. You can also access it from the live binder. It is under Behavioral Health, Job-alike Training and Sessions. And then day 2, evidence-based practices across the tiers. There are some additional resources up here. If you click on 10, 25, 21 handouts and resources, you'll be able to find the slide deck as well as the different resources we'll be highlighting throughout this morning's session. So we hope that you're able to easily access those. And we will go ahead and get started. You can enable, we do have the live captioning enabled. If you would like to see the captions, all you need to do is click that at the bottom of your screen, enable live caption, and you'll be able to see the captioning. So again, on behalf of the MTSS initiative, welcome. We're very glad to see all of our behavioral and SEL providers, mental health providers, attending this morning's session in this strand. Just a few notes as we get started. So there are teams participating in this series. This session was also open to anyone else who may be interested in learning about evidence-based practices across the tiers. So we welcome all of you. For those of you who are members of teams, you'll be hearing from, or if you've not already heard from and have those scheduled, site visits, job-alike site visits for your school psychologists, school counselors, maybe pupil services directors, admin who oversee behavioral and mental health services. If you have behavior specialists, licensed professionals in your school, any of those folks who are involved with the structure of behavioral and SEL services and mental health services provided in your school. So you'll hear from your regional leads in the West, Silky, Melissa; in the East, Gina and Tina; Central Region, Drew and myself. So if we haven't reached out, you'll be hearing from your leads very soon, and some of those site visits may be underway. So again, welcome everyone. We'll go ahead and get started. Our commitment to the least restrictive environment, our goal for each child is to ensure that individualized education program teams begin with the general education setting with the use of supplementary aids and services before considering a more restrictive environment. And of course, we are the Patton team and our mission at the Pennsylvania Training and Technical Assistance Network is to support the efforts and initiatives of the Bureau of Special Ed and to build the capacity of local educational agencies to serve students who receive special education services. So we will highlight some things this morning. Check out our family engagement initiative, but family engagement promotes equitable partnerships among schools, families, and communities to actively promote student achievement through shared commitment, decision-making, and responsibility. We also invite you to check out, and you should be able to, this should be in the live binder, and all of the resources also should be hyperlinked in your participant PDF of the handout. We invite you to check out PDE's Equitable Practices Hub. In Pennsylvania, equity has been defined as every student having access to the educational resources and rigor that they need at the right moment in their education across race, gender, ethnicity, language, disability, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, family background, and/or family income. So opportunity and access. And new, I think some of you may have joined. If you haven't, there are some upcoming sessions, 2 or 3 more. We invite you to check out the RTI for SLD determination fidelity tool that was newly released in 2021. We do have some sessions if that is something you are interested in looking at with your team. We certainly encourage you to do that. So as we look at Pennsylvania's multi-tiered system of support structures, broadly speaking, there are some essential components: high quality core instruction, universal screening, shared ownership, database decision making, RTI or response to intervention, family engagement, multiple tiers, and professional learning. And you will notice some of those will be highlighted this morning as we talk about evidence-based practices across the tiers. So as we think about those connections between Pennsylvania's multi-tiered system of supports and PDE's equity pillars of practice, that Equitable Practices Hub, we do encourage you to check that out. To do their best, students must feel safe at school. So students need that safe and healthy school environment, regardless of any background information. And those equity pillars, you'll notice these are some highly interconnected practices and pillars that are associated with equity in the day-to-day operationalization of viable and sustainable multi-tiered systems. So as we think about those general equity practices, self-awareness, data practices, family and community engagement, academic equity, disciplinary equity, we'll definitely be spending some time on these different pillars throughout our session this morning. And then the overall spheres, looking at the school, and what way can the school district or individual become more equitable across their systems? How can we do that at the classroom level? What can teachers do in manners of curriculum, discipline, pedagogy, and classroom culture become better proponents of equity? And finally, reflecting at the individual, what can we as individuals, whether teacher, administrator, behavior and SEL provider, mental health provider, do to promote equitable practices in our educational community? So you should be able to link to the document directly from your handouts. It should also be in the live binder, but just some questions to consider. What do you consider to be those universal equitable practices within your own MTSS? How are you working individually and collectively to positively influence and evaluate progress toward more equitable tiered services and supports? How might you use data to inform equitable access and opportunity to evidence-based supports and services? We will be talking about that throughout this morning's session. What are those data sources? How can we look at that through an equitable lens? How do we engage families and stakeholders to enhance equitable outcomes for all students? How might we ensure that students have access to culturally and linguistically responsive standards aligned core instruction while also providing students with intensive evidence-based academic, behavioral, and social emotional supports and services. And finally, how do you leverage all those components within your framework to leverage disciplinary and academic equity? So thinking specifically, how does your framework or system systematically reduce suspensions, expulsions, and restraints, as well as disproportionate representation of subgroups, for example, with SLD or placement in more restrictive settings? So ideally, we are moving toward integrated tiered systems. One of the resources, and if you were able to join us about a month ago, you had the opportunity to see Dr. Kathleen Lane out of the University of Kansas, where we really want to move toward integrated systems. And Dr. Lane and her colleagues have CI3T. You'll see that linked in a number of places, but where we're really integrating our effective academic, behavioral, and social emotional practices to meet the needs of all students. So you would have heard her talk some about universal screening.
Got it.
Good morning.
So
I just need to hear it. Can you?
Sorry about that. So evidence-based practices across the domains are integrated with classroom instruction across grade levels. And what really happens as we get better at integrating, teams become more sophisticated in understanding engagement through analysis and synthesis of academic, behavioral, and SEL data. So advanced tiers practices are aligned accordingly. And we encourage you to check out Dr. Lane's session next month at our PAPBS MTSS, or Equity is MTSS Forum, is the overarching theme. So we want to be able to, as a team, as an MTSS team, consistently and constantly celebrate those small wins. We think about the problem-solving process. What is the problem? What are we going to do? Let's do it and do it well. And did it work? So just a quick revisit between MTSS and RTI. MTSS is that comprehensive standard aligned school improvement framework. It's designed to enhance academic, behavioral, and SEL outcomes for all students. While RTI is that assessment process. It's a methodology that helps to serve as a component of identifying specific learning disabilities. RTI is embedded in that MTSS comprehensive framework. So it is much broader. Okay, so I've done a good bit of talking to get us kicked off this morning. We are going to have a little bit of fun and hope that this session is interactive for everyone. So we recognize that as behavior and SEL providers or administrators overseeing behavior and SEL practices at your LEA, that you're coming with a range of experiences and knowledge. And we know that you're coming from all over the state as well. So there are going to be opportunities throughout the morning to post in the chat and connect with other colleagues, job alert colleagues across the state. So one of the features that we'll use this morning is the stamp feature. And if you highlight your little toolbar, it might be beside your mute, stop video, chat feature. There's a little pencil that says annotate. And if you click on that, it should give you an option for stamp. Click on stamp and you'll see a few options below. So we're going to use the annotate feature. It's a little pencil. Click on that, find stamp, and you'll see the different options below. And I'd just like to give everyone a minute to practice stamping for those of you who haven't stamped before. Oh, perfect. We have some stampers. It's working for us this morning. Excellent. All right, look at that. So just another quick tip, when you want to get out of annotate, you'll see that toolbar that says like mouse, select, text. You can just X out of it. What I'm going to do right now is clear all drawings, and we're going to do a stamp on the next screen. Take a stamp and place it where your district is from. Let's see where people are from all across the state. That's one of the nice things about Zoom. We are able to much easier connect across the state. All right, we've got some folks from Butler, Beaver, Allegheny, Washington, Huntington County, Bradford and Tioga up in IU-17, over in Schuylkill, Delaware, Chester, all right, Lancaster, York, awesome. So we do have folks, and if you are not from Pennsylvania, there's a little bar at the top. You can check in that pink bar, you're not in PA. We do have some folks joining from out of state from time to time. All right, welcome. So I'm going to clear these drawings, hold your stamping for a moment. Okay, so take your best guess. I know that we might have some intermediate unit TAC. If you are maybe an intermediate unit TAC and there's not a stamp for you, post it up on the top. But place a stamp that shows where your role best applies. All right, so we have a few across the top. We have school counselors, school psychologists, some licensed specialists, special educators, admin. We don't have any school social workers yet. School social workers are an important part of this work. All right, awesome. And if your stamp feature doesn't work and you'd just like to post it in the chat, please feel free to do that. All right, excellent. Glad to have you all here. All right, so that helps us. Oh, we do have some school social workers. Welcome. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and clear all the annotations. And you can clear, if you click on that annotation bar, at the far right, there's a little X that will get you out of your annotation. So then when you're on your screen, it won't keep annotating. Okay, so thank you everyone for taking a little bit of time to share where you're from, what your role is. We're happy to have you here this morning. So our objectives today, we're really going to just highlight a lot of these evidence-based practices take training and technical support, and we are happy to partner with our intermediate unit training and consultant teams to be able to provide any follow-up support. So we're going to look at different data sources that can be helpful for use in secondary multi-tiered system of supports for behavior, social, emotional learning, mental health. We're going to identify some key elements of an effective tier 1 for behavior and SEL and mental health practices. And then we'll also identify some evidence-based interventions for advanced tiers. So because there's such a large continuum, this really is an opportunity to look at different data sources to help you prioritize where might be those areas of focus for your school with regard to behavior, SEL. What are some key elements in place, and what are some evidence-based interventions? In a half-day session, we're not going to be able to cover all of those things in depth, but really we're just going to kind of highlight some of those. And then our site visits are designed to help you dig a little bit deeper into your data and prioritize, is it tier 1 where we need to focus our efforts, or do we need to look at some advanced tiers based on our data for our efforts to expand our continuum of evidence-based practices for behavior and social emotional learning. So just a little bit of context, and I know I'm probably speaking to the choir with many job-alike colleagues, but just some context to consider as we think about the behavioral, mental health, social emotional needs of our students. So about 20% of school-age children experience mental health problems, with 10 to 15% who are suffering significant impairment with their success at school. About 44% of students with an emotional disturbance are likely to drop out of school. And that rate is even higher for African American and Latino youth. And the other important thing, and I know many of us are experiencing shortages in our field. I'm a school psychologist by training. We are experiencing some significant shortages of school psychologists, not only in Pennsylvania, but nationally. But 70 to 80% of youth receive their mental health services through a school district. So this isn't the time to be cutting positions for those who are able to provide behavioral and mental health services. And that just speaks to the important work that everyone does on this call as school psychs, as school counselors, as administrators who oversee that, our licensed professionals, our school social workers, BCBAs. We all play an important role in that. So we're going to kind of break up. I'm going to talk mainly about Tier 1 practices, and then Dr. Hunter will be talking about evidence-based practices throughout the morning. So if you do have questions, there are going to be some opportunities to share throughout the morning in the chat. But if you do have questions along the way, please post those, and our lovely patent co-host will jump in and help us respond to those. So Tier 1, it all starts with healthy, effective, universal supports. Thinking about our MTSS framework in Pennsylvania, high quality core instruction is at the foundation of it all. And that's not just for academics, right? That's also for social, emotional, and behavioral learning. So I'm going to pose a question to all of you in the chat. How do we know when our core or our Tier 1 behavioral and SEL practices are working for our students? How do we know? What are some thoughts that you have? Post those in the chat. How do we know when our core or our Tier 1 behavioral or SEL practices are working for our students? Okay, I'm seeing some good things in here. 80% of our students' needs are met. Academics improve as well as attendance. We see progress on our universal screener, less behavior and mental health needs. Office referrals are down. Our data will tell us that. Fewer referrals for Tier 2 and Tier 3. Oh, good. Looking at proportion of students receiving advanced tiers as one piece of the data. Higher than 80% are successful. Less need for Tier 2 and 3. We're seeing students using coping strategies, using the vocabularies. Decrease in referrals, percentages are appropriate and not flipped, right? We don't have an upside down triangle. All right, excellent, 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 excellent. And fewer special education referrals. Students can easily repeat the supports practices used in the building. I love those, those are great. And so that's where we really need to start. When we have strong Tier 1 in place, it helps reduce our need for Tier 2 and 3. It makes our Tier 2 and 3 more effective when we can tie that back to our practices at Tier 1. So I'm going to start off by highlighting a few data sources, and many of you mentioned this in the chat, and that is excellent. So we're going to look at some data sources that can kind of help us get a pulse on how is our core doing, and also help us engage in that systems level problem solving at core. So let's highlight a few data sources. Many of you mentioned this, office discipline referrals, looking at those school-wide trends. So important. We want to know that at least 80% or more of our students aren't having high numbers of office discipline referrals. Specifically, zero office discipline referrals is ideal. 0 to 1 is considered Tier 1. But there are different systems. This is just an example from Swiss, the Schoolwide Information System out of University of Oregon, a nonprofit that helps us make data decisions. So when we enter data into the Swiss system, it helps us generate more questions and helps us in that decision-making progress. It can help with Tier 1 practices. So we might be looking at things like the average referrals per day per month. And we look at this historically and we see, oh boy, we know December has been a problem historically. So what kind of prevention efforts can we put into place? What do we need? So the data lets us know there's an issue in December. That might lead us to ask more questions. Who is it happening with? Where is it happening? Why might it be happening? What's the specific problem behavior? When we get very precise, then we're able to make better decisions and link actions that are more likely to work. So we can look at things like average referrals per day per month. We can look at referrals by time of day. What are our most problematic times of day? And we can drill down a little bit further. What about by location? In this example, classroom seems to be a location with a lot of referrals. So what is happening in the classroom? As we look, and when classroom is one of the locations with highest number of referrals, recall back to our opening slides, talking about the importance of having that integrated system of academics and behavior and SEL supports. Sometimes we might have high referrals in the classroom because we have an instructional mismatch. We might not be using core strategies that are grounded in evidence that get most kids to be able to read or to be able to do math. Sometimes we need to revisit our academic approaches. We need to be able to integrate effective behavioral approaches with our academic instruction. So that might help us answer some more questions. Other information as we look school-wide is looking referrals by day of the week. So in this example, and just kind of pull these from the example data, hopefully we're not getting a lot of referrals on Saturday and Sunday. But looking across the days of the week, is there a day of the week that we seem to have more behavioral referrals, office discipline referrals? That can help us problem solve. Having the information by which problem behavior we are seeing the most of. I'll just kind of pause here in the chat. We have middle and high school folks. So what are the problem behaviors we see most often at middle school? Give you a minute to post that in the chat. Okay, I'm seeing some. Okay, pure conflict, defiance, disrespect, work avoidance, technology, phones, disrespect toward peers. Okay, dress code. Okay, disrespect toward peers and staff, inappropriate language. All right. So middle school, so we noticed some trends nationally in behavioral data. Elementary tends to be peer-to-peer, and and we can have a host of other discipline referral issues. When we get to middle school, we still have some of that peer-to-peer depending on that middle school age range. The other thing that starts to show up, some of you have noted this, disrespect or defiance towards staff, towards adults and peers. Attendance, we'll talk a little bit about attendance this morning. Okay, good. How about for those of you who work in high school? What are the biggest discipline trends at the high school level? You got first three, you're getting the national trends right there. The biggest issues in high school, and we can still have a host of others, tend to be cutting class, being late to school, can be attendance issues, skipping school, and we can see other ones in there as well. And vaping. Yeah, okay, great, thank you everyone. So nationally, what we tend to see, our youngest students tend to be peer-to-peer, shoving each other on the playground, peer-to-peer interaction. Middle school, we start to make that shift, still peer-to-peer difficulties, and then some adult, peer-to-adult conflict. And then in high school, it tends to shift toward attendance, cutting class, being late. All across, we'll see things like refusal to complete work, and that might be a sign of instructional mismatch. Those are data that are very helpful for us to ask more questions and engage in some really meaningful systems level problem solving. We can also look at referrals by grade, or there's certain grade levels. Again, when we look at these data, it's not to blame a certain grade, like all those 6th grade kids. It's a helpful time Maybe that's a transition year. Maybe we need to dig a little bit deeper. They're not fully understanding the routines and behavioral expectations. Maybe we need to provide more teaching, more reinforcement, etc. And then we also can look at referrals by student. You know, we want to see, and many of you got this earlier, a large percentage of our students, when we have a good tier 1, we shouldn't have a ton of students receiving office discipline referrals. So we want to look in those students who are receiving 16 office discipline referrals. We sure hope that they are getting some advanced tier support. That is a big red flag. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but you can look at a triangle report similar to how you look at your triangle reports for academic data. So tier 1 research has established some cut points essentially. When students have no or maybe one office discipline referral in a year, that's a good indicator they're responding to tier 1. When students have 2 to 5 office discipline referrals, that's an indicator. Tier 2, we probably need to start getting some supports in place. I believe in a moment I have a link to the October catch, but if not, I'll talk about that. October is a critical time, and we're glad you're here with us today. And as students receive 6 or more, they definitely need some very intensive supports and problem solving to help remediate and to help prevent and help provide treatment to those issues. You can also look across time. This is a 1-year triangle report, so 2020, 2021. And we can look at that historically. And when we take that triangle report across multiple years, it makes it into a rectangle, but that's okay. So you can kind of see what you'd like to see over time is that the green area is having increases while the yellow and red are decreasing. So this is pretty strong. This is a school or district example where they've been holding pretty steady on this. But you can look at your triangle report. So if you're seeing this green area going down, that's a kind of a red flag. We need to look at core if we're losing ground with this. Looks like it's just slightly growing. And so we're aligned in that, at least 85% responding to core, 10 to 15% needing more intensive supports. So another thing is we think about equity at the foundation of what we do, making sure that we aren't having disproportionate outcomes for different groups of students. Swiss can give you this. It's called a risk index and a risk ratio. And if you want to, I'll just give you kind of a brief overview of this today. This is something we can talk with you about a little bit more at your site visits. If you want a pretty in-depth session about this, we'd encourage you to join. It's in our school psychology. Our school psychologist's change agent series, but really it would be appropriate for social workers, school counselors, administrators overseeing that. But Dr. Tim Runge will be doing a session for us on doing a district data story all about PBIS data. I believe that's January 6th, but it is up for registration on the patent calendar. It's called creating a district data story. So a risk index is a percent of a group of students that receives a particular outcome, typically a negative outcome, which is equivalent to the likelihood that someone from that group will receive that outcome. So in this instance, we have a risk index of this. So for example, of the 6 students identified as American Indian Alaskan Native, 50% have at least one referral. Of the 7 students identified as Asian, at least 14% have one referral. So that's the percent of a group that receives a particular outcome. And we first want to look at the risk index. Are there any groups that have a higher likelihood of receiving that outcome? And in this example, it is an office discipline referral. Then what we can do is look at the risk ratio. So a risk ratio is a percent of that group that receives a particular outcome, or the numerical expression, and it's expressed in either a ratio or a decimal showing the risk of that outcome for a particular group when it's compared to that same outcome for all other groups of students. So you can look at this by race, ethnicity. You can look at this by special education status. You can look at this by socioeconomic status. But in this example, so we'll see students who are identified as as Alaska Native or American Indian have 1.33 times the risk of receiving one discipline referral when compared to all other student groups. You can look at each group. Ideally, we want that to be one that represents all student groups have that same likelihood. So that's an important thing to consider whenever we're looking at equity as the foundation. Is our behavioral system working for all students? And again, you can look at referral rates by group. So you can look at, for example, all students. Looks like about 1.33. As we look at American Indian, Alaska Native, they received an average of 1.67 referrals per student in the 2020-2021 school year. And you can look, across different student groups and look at those rates. So that's important. We want to make sure that our systems are working for all students and we aren't having students that are having disproportionately negative outcomes. We can look at that for office discipline referrals. We can look at that for special education referrals, for example, identification of students with emotional disturbance. So I did want to mention, as we talk about office discipline referrals, the October catch, and there's a helpful article linked in your resources for you. But one thing I hope that if you go back today to your districts, the number of office discipline referrals that students receive by the end of October is a good predictor for the number of referrals they're likely to receive by the end of the year. So what that means is about half of students who had 6 or more total ODRs, and if you remember, that's at the top of our triangle, right? Those are the students needing individualized, the most intensive supports, already had 2 or more ODRs by the end of October. And of those students, 79% had 2 or more by the end of December. So one of the things, if you're not looking at this already, and we're going to talk about some other data sources as well, but check your October data and who are those students who are on track to have additional office discipline referrals. And office discipline referrals are associated with some adverse outcomes. The more office discipline referrals that students have, that impacts a number of things later in life. Decreases, and we're going to talk about our learning system, kind of a nice segue into this. But students who have a lot of office discipline referrals are more likely to drop out of school, are more likely to have involvement with law enforcement, are more likely to need additional supports and services as adults. So intervening early is very critical. And here are Pennsylvania's early warning system metrics, which if you see behavior, school code of conduct, or an office discipline referral is one of those metrics. And so we're looking at the ABCs. So number 1, we're looking at attendance. And those of you working in middle and high school, our high school students are the ones who tend to have the most referrals for cutting class, for being late to school, for skipping school, tardies, etc. So looking at things, attendance, behavior, school code of conduct, which is our ODRs, are state reportable offenses, things like drugs, weapons, serious bodily injury, those reportable offenses. And then our course performance, our mathematics, and our LA. So we're looking at those different metrics. I'll just have you post in the chat real quick. How many of you have an early warning system in place? If your school or district has an EWS, post that in the chat. Okay. All right. So some do. Excellent. Grow the green. Yes. Thank you, Silky. Most do. Some are new. Okay. Informally, we're working on. Okay. Excellent. So the goal of your early warning system is to identify students off track for graduation. We know long-term outcomes for students who don't graduate high school, limited earning potentials in their career, more likely to have, drug and alcohol use issues, interaction with law enforcement, mental health issues. So we really want to see all of our students graduate, everyone having that access and opportunity. So our metrics, we want to grow that green. And to let us know we're on track, we need to have attendance at greater than 90%. We kind of get in that warning when students are 80 to 90%, and then they're really off track whenever they're attending less than 80% of school. So we want to be able to intervene with attendance. Behavior, office discipline referrals, so Pennsylvania metrics, less than 3, 0 to less than 3. In our early warning system, yellow 4 to 5, red is 5 or more. I would encourage you to keep that extra element of the October catch and the research on that in your back pocket. Reportable offenses, if they get any reportable offense, drugs, weapons, serious bodily injury, they're off track, even with one offense. And then our course performance, when students, they need to be passing. If they're failing a course, that is a red flag that they are off track for graduation. So having a snapshot like this, as we think about integration of academics and behavior, having this early warning system snapshot is really helpful to look at that big picture for any student. And that's where, as behavior and SEL providers, you can really be a great support to that early warning systems team. Okay, I'll just take a pause for a second. Drew, Gina, Karen, are there any, I was kind of glancing at the chat, but are there any questions or things you want to add at this point?
Not seeing any questions. I would just put a reminder out though that I did put this in the chat, but teams participating in this series, developing that early warning system is part of the series requirement. So hopefully your team, if that's not already in place, I know many schools do have that in place. If not, that would be something to potentially work on with your team this year. And then hopefully our behavioral health, school-based behavioral health folks are supporting that team and looking at that data and identifying student needs based on it.
Okay. All right. Yes, that is part of your overarching in that live binder is developing, if you don't have one developed, working on developing that early warning system as part of the middle and high school series partnership. Okay, so we talked a little bit about office discipline referral data. We talked about early warning system metrics. Now let's talk a little bit about school climate data. And I'll take you out to the websites. How many of you are currently collecting school climate data? You've been working with the regional school climate coordinator from your intermediate unit. You're collecting and using those data. Feel free to post that in the chat. Hopefully I'll pop out to this one. So the National School Climate Center, I'll link out there and then go back, has a ton of wonderful resources on there to help promote safe, supportive learning environments for all students. And so you can see a lot of different assessment tools on there, research and evaluation, policy coming out, educational services, supporting bias and bullying, and there's a lot of publications on there to check out. So Pennsylvania specifically, each intermediate unit has a school climate regional coordinator that can help with this. I'm just going to check the chat real quick. All right, currently, some of you are currently doing that. Excellent. More at the elementary level. Great, you're doing yours in November, December. So the PA School Climate Survey, you can see, you'll get a link and everything from your school climate regional coordinator. And so this not only gets information from faculty and staff, also from students, and also from families and community. It provides really valuable resources to see, a few different things. Number one, the student support scale looks at how students feel listened to, cared about, helped by teachers and other adults in the school. The peer social emotional learning scale measures students' perception of their peers' social and problem solving skills. And the safe and respectful climate scale measures two things: how physically safe students feel and how emotionally safe students feel. But we encourage you to can read more about it, the process, readiness, the evaluation part, action planning, implementation, and being able to reflect on those data. Okay. What do you see on my screen? I just got new computers the other week. Do you see my PowerPoint or do you see all of my internet tabs?
We see your PowerPoint.
Okay, thanks, Melissa. All right. So then I'll also take you out to PAYS data and the Pennsylvania Youth Survey. How many of you are utilizing PAYS data in your district? Post that in the chat. All right, excellent. Okay, yeah, every other year it's administered 6th, 8th, 10th, and 12th grades. Great, and perfect for middle and high school. So the PAYS data can really provide some valuable information as you think about planning your resources. So it helps provide, you as behavior SEL providers, administrators, even policymakers with critical information about the use and abuse of, or about students' use and abuse of maybe harmful substances, drug use, gambling. Other ones include thoughts of suicide, attempted suicide, engaging in risky behaviors. And this helps, I'll just pull up 2019 and just kind of pull, so we'll look at the statewide profile. So it gives you, and when you get access, you may need to work with your superintendent or your admin on this, but the Pennsylvania Commission on Crime and Delinquency kind of sponsors and oversees this, but I'll highlight a few of the reports in here. So things like you can look over time at the different using drugs, for example, lifetime use. You can look over time statewide, are we seeing, for example, a decrease? Are we seeing an increase in any of these areas? Vaping. That was new when I was still a practitioner. Vaping came out. So, vaping substances as new trends occur in our adolescent populations, knowing what grade levels are being impacted statewide. You can look at a county report, you can look at your own district report, but just looking, where might you focus some of your prevention efforts, knowing that these are the trends. So, the percent of students that indicated they used a electronic vaping product in the last year. This is from 2019. So, 2015, it looked like about 25% of sixth graders, up to 30, and then 2019 in 4 years' time, about 42%. So, we're noticing a big increase here, maybe dropping off across the higher grade levels with just flavoring, nicotine, marijuana, other substances. So you can look across different patterns, and sorry for scrolling fast. This is a big report. I want to get to some of the mental health ones. So I'll try and do this on the side. Gambling. Here are some great ones. I like to look at this data, look at it in your county, look at it at your school. Are you doing PBIS? Do your students, does your PAYS data kind of corroborate? It's one source of data, it's student perception. Does it kind of corroborate with your PBIS data? Helping to look at all of those different sources at once. So there are a lot of chances for students in my school to talk one-on-one with a teacher. I have a chance to be part of class discussions, activities. I feel safe at my school. If we're seeing dips or we're seeing percentages of kids not feeling safe at school, we want to dig a little bit deeper. How can our systems help address those things? So my teachers, this one, for our friends doing PBIS, my teachers praise me when I work hard in school. I'd be pretty concerned if we're a PBIS school and only 40% of students, for example, are reporting that. So just a few things to consider as we look at PAYS data. There are also questions like, I've attempted suicide. I've thought about suicide. I feel just overall, depressed on most days. Those are things, and as we think about advocating for social, emotional, and behavioral supports, pull those data and then personalize it. So in our school, in our graduating class of seniors, 20 out of 100 seniors said they had, felt sad or depressed coming to school every day. Or the question about how many students reported coming to school drunk or high every day, and then personalize those data. We have this many in our senior class. That means this many of our students reported this concerning behavior as ways to for prevention, for advocacy. So we just went out to the PAYS web tool, but it's been in existence since about 1989, and it just collects information to learn from 6th, 8th, 10th, 12th, and it's done every other year. So we're in a PAYS year right now, to get information about their behavior, knowledge about alcohol, vaping, tobacco, other drugs, as well as protective factors like, I feel safe at school, my teachers are praising me, as well as other risk factors. So we'd encourage you to check that out if you haven't already done so. And then there's a lot of helpful different reports that you can get. These are just, a few examples. More and more school districts are participating in the PAYS. And so things like low commitment to school, be concerned about that. How can we strengthen our tier 1 practices, not just behavioral, social, emotional, but also academic? Why are we seeing a low commitment to school? About half of students are feeling committed to school. How can we improve that? So just, looking for different, it's just one data source. Again, corroborate those data with other, look at your PBIS data if you're doing PBIS. Look at your school climate data if you're doing school climate. Look at your attendance data. Look at multiple sources of data to kind of help corroborate. So, looking at academic data, if high percentages of kids are reaching, one of our solution actions might be to improve that core reading or math instruction. Okay, so that's PAYS data. We're going to talk briefly, and some of you mentioned this in the opening, about looking at behavioral screening data. And Dr. Lane talked about some behavioral screeners in our CI3T session last month. A number of you mentioned we're looking at, our screening data over time. Are we seeing less students popping up at risk? So here are a few, and as part of your work, maybe you don't have a screener in place. Maybe this is something you consider with your stipend funds. Expanding your continuum of evidence-based assessments and practices. So there is the BASC-3 BESS from Camp House and Reynolds that you can utilize. An oldie but a goodie, freebie is the student risk screening scale, internalizing and externalizing. It's been around since the 90s from Drummond. I know many PBIS teams use this. And then there's a helpful integrated one, the SABRS, the social, academic, and emotional behavioral risk screening. So when we look at really integrated screening, the SABRS will do that for you. Hopefully my link is working. So in your copy of your slide deck, you can read a little bit more about those three. You can also check out more on CI3T, but ideally what we want our universal screeners to be able to do is to be able to determine who are those students maybe who are at risk. Who are those students who might need some more supports? Additionally, as we're looking at our entire system, we want to see numbers of students who are screening to be at risk kind of decrease over time, and more students not at risk on those screeners. Again, it's not a diagnostic, it's just kind of a quick pulse and helping to determine who is at risk and who is not at risk. One of the neat things I saw, I have experience as an intermediate unit TAC, and seeing a school district implement the SRSS and having the opportunity to work with them. They worked very hard on their PBIS. They got SEL in place. We're implementing, as Dr. Hunter will talk about in a little bit, check in, check out. And over time, over 2 to 3 years, they started to see the number of students at risk decrease over time. Just as another data point, they were seeing office discipline referrals decrease, and they were seeing the number of students at risk on the screener decrease over time with the implementation of those practices with Fidelity. So I know I talked about a few potential data sources. We always kind of want to start with data before we get into approaches. What data do we have that's showing kind of what is our district, our schools need at the middle high school level? It's not one size fits all. We want to be good stewards of the resources that we have. We want to be effective and efficient and equitable in allocating our resources. So I just highlighted a few, but what other data sources do you use to evaluate strengths and needs and prioritize your efforts, especially around Tier 1? So are there other data sources maybe that you are looking at? Okay, so students who are not receiving incentives, pass survey. And Shelley, do you want to post what pass stands for in the chat? If you wouldn't mind, thank you. Other data sources other than early warning system, attendance, behavior, course performance. That's okay, thanks, Shelley. Hey, we're all friends here, we're all a team. Post extra links, feel free to converse with one another in the chat. This is a Java-like session, so thanks for doing that. The early warning system, office discipline referrals, reportable offenses, looking at school climate data, looking at our screening data, looking at PAYS data. I'll give you a few others to consider. So our CEDAR, our special education data reporting, I can load that on the Padlet a little bit later. but are you having higher percentages, for example, of students identified with emotional disturbance when compared to the state average? And then also kind of taking our risk ratio and our risk index. Are we identifying certain groups of students disproportionately for emotional disturbance, for example, might be another data source. We may not have our school nurse friends on here, but visits to the school nurse's office, visits to the school counselor's office, that might be another data source. Kids who are, it might not be something that we are formally tracking, but looking at the number, you know, do we have some kids who are frequent visitors to the school counselor's office, to the school nurse's office, for example. And of course, as Dr. Lane talked about, you know, our academic screening data. Okay, yeah, great. Looking at kids who may not be referred to the office, but who aren't being recognized for desirable behavior for school-wide. So those kids who aren't getting ODRs, but they're also not getting any recognition or acknowledgement. Great point, Meredith. But these are some of the things that we can do as we come on site. We will, you know, consider the data sources that you have available. Look at those data and help you kind of drill down and prioritize some areas of need with regard to social, emotional, and behavioral supports. So it starts with data. So thanks everyone for your thoughts. All right. And we will take around 10 o'clock-ish, 10:15, I would say, Dr. Hunter, if you could prompt me at that time. We will take a mid-morning break. Sometimes when I'm presenting on my computer, I talk at my computer all morning and then I forget when it's break time. So if someone could prompt me, feel free.
I'll keep you on track.
All right, thank you. And any questions popping up in the chat before we get into approaches?
No, but we did get the name for that past survey. It's the Pupil Attitudes Towards Self and School. And I did Google that briefly, and it looks like that's like a proprietary, something you'd have to like purchase.
Okay. All right, thanks for looking that up. Okay, so let's talk about tier 1 approaches. Again, it all starts with a strong core. And I would be remiss if I didn't take just a minute as we think about whether we are adopting new tier 1 practices, evidence-based practices at the advanced tiers. There's some research on implementation science. So before installing any new initiative or program, it's important for us to understand kind of that process of systems change. So just because you come to a session today and maybe Drew and I are at your site visit doesn't mean the next day you'll have that practice in place. And you getting some feedback from you in the group here today of participants, you know, I'm hearing some of you are in the exploration or the initial installation of early warning system, for example. So just as a kind of a progression, we may waver a little bit between these, but whenever there's a new innovation or program or practice, we kind of go through that exploration. Should we do it? Is this something we should do? Data will help us make that decision as we kind of explore. Should we implement PBIS? Should we implement school-wide SEL? Then we go through the phase, and especially at systems level, when there's a lot of moving parts, where we go through time to build infrastructure. We have those leadership teams and we install those practices. So we can think about that as installation. And many of you this year with early warning system might move from exploration to installation. And then we get to that initial implementation. So we've kind of built it, customized it for our system. We've taken those components of what works in research. We're initially implementing it. And we had some bumps along the road, but that's why it's important to do systems level fidelity checks to help us action plan and problem solve around any of those bumps. But we get better at it over time. I've worked with just so many PBIS teams. I know a number of you on here, my colleagues from Patton have done this as well. And it's just really nice to see whenever a team kind of goes from exploration, where kind of the mindset is, students need to have a lot of consequences. We need to increase our punishment to get behavior under control, to kind of learning about teaching and reinforcing behavior and learning about those evidence-based principles of, behavioral management of PBIS. And then to see schools take that time to build their PBIS framework, initially implement it, and then get to full implementation, and then see their data start to come along with that. Having very few suspensions or expulsions, having significant decreases in office discipline referrals, or seeing attendance rates increase, whatever kind of their area of focus was. But we get to full implementation where we do the practice, we do it better, and we get really innovative with it and really efficient. We can have drift across implementation, and that's why doing, whether it's systems level or an advanced tiers practice, doing those fidelity checks and action planning helps us stay on track. So briefly, there's a recording for this, I believe, from last year. I'll just do a very brief overview. But as you think about any practice that you're considering implementing, the hexagon, it's an exploration tool. It helps teams really at any stage, but most effectively when they're exploring a new program, to look at, they can compare a few different programs. So maybe we want to look at a universal screener, and we can compare 3 here. This might be something you as a behavioral SEL provider could do, help facilitate. Your intermediate unit consultant could help facilitate this. We at Patton could help facilitate. But we're looking to make sure that any programs or practices are going to be a good fit. And so we're looking at evidence. Is there evidence that this practice works? We want to make sure that it works. What kind of outcome data does this practice get? How much was the cost effectiveness? So we want to look, will this work for our population of students? Usability, is it a well-defined program? Do we have any sites to observe? Has it been replicated? What supports are available? So getting some assistance from your intermediate unit consultant, for example, is an external support, providing coaching and supervision. They're trained in many of these different practices. What staffing do we need to be able to implement this? What data systems do we need to be able to implement this practice? What administrative support do we need? And then is it identifying a need? We're looking at those data. Have we identified, for example, we looked at our data and we have a lot of students who are on our screening scale experiencing anxiety. We have a lot of these students who are visiting the nurse or the school counselor frequently. They're missing school. So we maybe identified a need. And is this going to address that identified need? How does this fit with your current initiatives? Does it have a good fit? Does it fit with the family, the community values, the culture, and history? How might it have an impact on other interventions and initiatives? On the MTSS initiative, we talk about evidence-based practices, and sometimes when we're implementing a new evidence-based practice, we may have to de-implement something that doesn't have any evidence. So, PBIS, for example, maybe our previous discipline system needs to be de-implemented because it's all punitive in nature and it's missing those foundational components. So there might be things, the demerit system needs to be de-implemented. It's a low value practice. It isn't having good outcomes for our students. And then finally, do we have the capacity to implement it? Do we have that financial capacity? Do we have the structure, the infrastructure in place to be able to support it? Are we getting some buy-in from practitioners who will be doing this, from family? So you can look at these different indicators, compare practices side by side, and then just as a team, sit down and go through for the practices you want to look at. There are some questions, and then you kind of give it a rating. and that can help you in your decision making. So just a tool, the hexagon is on there for you as you consider any practices or programs. All right. Yep. Yes, it is. It should be linked on the Padlet. Thanks, guys. Any other questions or thoughts? All right. Good. Okay. Okay. So I want to highlight the PDE Staff and Student Wellness Toolkit. So our partners at the Department of Education. Let's see if this clicks for me. It is. All right. So there is a helpful staff and student wellness guide. We often talk about, as we think about tier 1 approaches, we're very focused on students. We also need to ensure the social and emotional wellness of our staff. Socially and emotionally well staff who feel safe and supported at their job and have the right tools to do their job are much more effective. So this is just a helpful, there's a webinar, there's a helpful guide here. As we think about the roadmap, just kind of some helpful checklists, developing what is our communication plan, what does social and emotional wellness support look like for staff, a lot of helpful, just easily kind of items to consider. You can action plan around those. And then there are some general wellness resources that you can check out in here. And then within the guide, there are just various tips, how do we support staff wellness, for example? How are we supporting that? And there's a whole section on staff wellness. And then we get into supporting student wellness. So just a helpful document I'd encourage you to check out from PDE. Another one,
and so, and she says standard stuff.
Okay, sorry about that. Another one, and we encourage you, I believe it's November 16th or November 18th. We have actually one of the authors of this brief, Dr. Sandy Shafolius, and she was recently the first citation in the the U.S. Department of Education document that talked about mental health in students coming out of the pandemic. But the University of Connecticut Collaboratory on School and Child Health, there is, it is the Simple Strategies document. And this is, Dr. Shafolius will go into this in a little bit more depth, but I really, really like this document. If you don't have any formalized programs or funds in place, this document helps kind of guide through different kernels from the research that are strategies that anyone can do. They're low cost or free. They're easy to implement, and they're grounded in research. And I'll just highlight real quick about how this flows. So you'll see different common reactions to trauma exposure across the life course. And so you'll see these are common reactions. So think about, adolescents, adults, that's mostly who we are working with in middle and high school, maybe some older adults. So what are some common reactions after there have been trauma? And COVID is ongoing. So people's experiences can be very different dependent upon, what they've experienced during the pandemic. So, embedded within an MTSS framework, we want to be able to use strategies that are simple, that prevent the occurrence of maladaptive reactions. We want to actively teach strategies to promote adaptive reactions and counter those maladaptive reactions. And we want to be able to reinforce adaptive reactions. So we might have some used by others, taught to individuals, are used by others in the simple strategies. So I'll give you an example. So physiological kernels, I really like this one. It will give you a definition of what that kernel is. So positive greeting. I'll put in another plug. One of our keynotes at the forum coming up next month in November is Dr. Clay Cook, who did some research on positive greetings. You might have heard of it as 4 at the door plus 1 more, but helping to increase engagement, for example, for students and increasing those feelings of social and emotional safety. So just a simple definition: frequent positive or friendly hello, asking someone about their day, high five. We have to be careful with that now. But what are the relevant outcomes? When teachers stand at their doors and greet all their middle and high school students as they come in, improve perceptions of safety, improve behavior that we see in students, less aggression, increased politeness. And so as we think about like staff, standing in hallway during transition times and just providing positive greetings to students or greeting students as they enter the classroom. Administrators, how can we do this for adults in our school? Greeting teachers, sending electronic greetings. And then each one has different links for more reading on the kernel that you'd like to check out for students and for adults. And then there's some kernels for coping whenever there is an issue occurring. How can we help with things like self-monitoring or progressive muscle relaxing? Increasing adaptive responses, verbal praise. I really like this one, peer-to-peer written praise. Might be a neat addition to our core practices. Special play, I think we'd all love that. Adults interact with student. I think we'd like special play as adults sometimes too. So anyway, just definitely check that out. All of these are free. They've grounded it in the research to embed in our tier 1 practices that anyone can do. Our bus drivers, our paraeducators, our cafeteria staff. So I'm going to pose a question to everyone. Before I talk about PBIS, is your school implementing PBIS, school-wide PBIS at your middle or high school building? We've seen a lot of high schools and middle schools adopting this. I've seen a ton of increase over the past few years. Excited to see that. It is a little bit different at the high school level. If your school is implementing it, don't look on the wall. See if you can post from memory your 3 to 5 school-wide expectations in the chat. All right, we've got one: respectful, accountable, motivated, safe. All right. Yeah, great point. Some districts are, but it may not be implemented at the classroom level. Focused, leaders, accountable, motivated, extraordinary, safe, hero, roar, respectful, outstanding, acceptable, responsible. Bearcats, that's Huntington. Working on it. Pride, soar, pride. Oh, this is wonderful. Great. So this is one of the things that we not only want the adults to see, we also want students to be part of this. So great. So we're going to talk a little bit about PBIS as a tier 1 practice. Thank you, everyone. So if you haven't, many of you are familiar, and systems level approaches, school-wide positive behavioral interventions and supports. If you have not checked it out, check out papbs.org. A number of us on the call, I know Melissa's here, Silky, Drew, myself, trying to scroll through quick. Donna, we have a lot of school-wide facilitators, and we at Patton support intermediate unit consultants, and we partner with them, the intermediate unit consultants and others from the community of practice, maybe mental health providers, have local facilitators that go through essentially a year of training, and then they work with a mentor to become an independent facilitator. But school-wide PBIS in Pennsylvania, check out papbs.org, and you can read more about school-wide PBIS in Pennsylvania. So, everything from commitment to fidelity, it all starts with a team, that leadership team. And one of those critical members of a PBIS core team is someone with mental and behavioral health expertise, such as a school counselor, school psych, social worker, someone with that training and experience. So we encourage you to check this out. But key features include school-wide expectations in positively stated terms. We are actively teaching what those expectations look like. We are providing reinforcement. Data is at the foundation of everything we do. We are having clearly defined procedures for responding to behavior problems. And there is one huge thing at the middle and high school level, essential for your PBIS to work, is to have student voice. PBIS shouldn't be something, I think it was Rob Horner that said this, PBIS shouldn't be something we do to kids, it's something we do with students. So we actively partner. They can give us great feedback on expectations, on sharing school-wide data trends. They can give us some great insight into why is everyone late during first period. They can give us some great insight onto things that are meaningful as far as recognition and acknowledgement. So having a student team is just so valuable for your secondary PBIS. So if you don't have a student team, and I know Huntington's on, I've seen Huntington's student team in action. They have a great student team. Just encourage you to check that out. So that is one kind of school-wide approach. I'm going to talk a little bit then about social and emotional learning. All right, and as I'm kind of talking, post in the chat if you are implementing SEL, a formalized SEL program at the middle or high school setting. So I'll go ahead, Drew.
I was going to say it's 9:53 and we're kind of at a natural break. I didn't know if maybe you wanted to do your morning break and then we can do the last couple of topics before advanced tiers following the break.
Perfect. Probably everyone's ready for a break.
All right.
Thank you. So we will go ahead.
I was going to say we'll do a 15-minute break approximately.
Okay, so we'll return at 10:08.
All right. Okay.
Okay. All right, welcome back. Everyone can see the correct screen. It should say, what is SEL, right? Still learning my new, all right, thanks, Drew. Still learning my new computers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about SEL, just kind of tie up some things about tier 1, and then Drew's going to take it over as we get into advanced tiers. So SEL is an integral part of education and human development. It's that process through which all young people and adults acquire and apply the knowledge, skills, and attitudes to develop healthy identities, manage emotions, and achieve personal and collective goals, how they feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain supportive relationships, and make responsible and caring decisions. So CASEL, you should see that resource. That is from, there we go. So what is SEL? It's intentional, it's systemic. It's not just something we do for 1 or 2 students or students who need advanced tier support. It's systemic. It's what all humans need to know. It helps it helps us with learning self-awareness to move towards self-efficacy as well as self-advocacy. So the benefits of SEL, it's based upon decades of meta-analysis, and some of the highlights from the research that high quality SEL programming leads to things like improved academic performance, improvement in student social emotional skill, in their grades, in relationships, their perception of school, helps to decrease anxiety, behavior issues, substance use, has a long-term impact even up to 18 years later, and has an 11-to-1 fiscal return on investment. So that's pretty good return on your investment. And as we think about different data sources, some highlights in here. If our PAYS data, if we're having a lot of kids with substance issues, with high office discipline referrals, a lot of kids experiencing anxiety, those might be some indicators that some good SEL programming, high quality SEL programming, may be something we want to consider. So how many of you are familiar with PA career ready skills? I'm sure my school counselors are. If you are, just post in the chat, yes or no. So those are Pennsylvania career ready progressions. There are social emotional learning progressions that help with the development of student competence. So by design, they really reflect priorities to ensure youth are career ready and meet the demands of the 21st career. Okay, so we have some yeses, we have some nos, great. So those of you who are very familiar, please feel free to post some other things in the chat as I kind of highlight this for those who this is new to. So you will see there are some echoes of the CASEL resources, but they're not exactly the same, but they're very similar. So there are some social emotional learning progressions from the PA career ready skills across 3 domains and 4 different grade bands. And the priorities are to ensure that youth are career ready. So as we think about domain 1, self-awareness and self-management, skills to understand and manage behavior, including the abilities to set goals, recognize feelings, and respond effectively to challenges. The second domain is establishing and maintaining healthy relationships. So being able to have healthy interpersonal relationships, communication, resolving conflicts. And then finally, social problem solving, helping students understand social norms, make responsible choices, and engage effectively in diverse contexts. So I know I worked at the high school level as a practitioner, and I think about some students who got placed on work experience that maybe had the skills to perform the actual job, but the employers would essentially remove them from their place of employment because students were lacking some of these social and emotional skills. So things like showing up to work on time or not engaging in conflict with their coworkers, being able to problem solve on the job. So I can recall a number of meetings at the high school setting where, we wanted to get kids on work experience as part of their high school credit for the valuable experience it would provide them. And then they were needed to further develop some of these PA career ready skills. So you can kind of see across the grade bands, you'd focus, as middle and high school providers, grade bands 6 to 8, 9 to 12, you can see how that looks, self-awareness and self-management, and then how it connects to employability skills. So that resource is uploaded for you as well. So establishing and maintaining relationships, social problem solving skills, how that might look for middle and high school, and how that's important to employability. So as you think about, okay, so maybe I'm not doing this, or maybe we're starting to do this, how might you embed these skills into your practices? You can check out the PA Career Ready Skills implementation, and it has a toolkit with it. It includes performance indicators, supportive practices, and teaching strategies. So this is an example what you might do, domain B for grades 6 to 8, for example. Explain how empathy and perspective taking foster relationship building. And these grids will help you support your own understanding of what those career ready skills are and that of your peers, and take them and bring them into your classroom. And I'll just click this real quick. So you can see on the PDE website, the continuum of skills introduction. You can find the toolkit here. And there's all kinds of great resources on the PA career ready skills. All right. So as we think about, if we're not doing school-wide social emotional learning, we want to use something that we know has efficacy, that is effective, that it's been researched. And we want to think about kind of two measurements as we look at SEL. Number one, just like with PBIS, just like with our advanced tiers, any of our practices, we want to make sure we're implementing with fidelity. We have that constant data point of fidelity. So are we doing what we are intending to do? And are we implementing all those necessary active ingredients to get those outcomes? So are we doing what we intended to do as it was designed to be implemented? And then the other part is measuring students' SEL competencies or student outcomes. So that is another part of thinking about our measurements in relation to SEL. So I believe I have this pulled up, but the school-wide SEL process, you can check out CASEL and how do we implement and how do we measure that. So it kind of aligns a little bit, right, to the NERN implementation stages, organize or kind of explore and get that initial installation. Then we implement, and then we kind of hit full implementation where we're practicing continuous improvement. So we're building that foundational support. We're creating a plan. We want to implement, again, not just for our students, but we also want to strengthen SEL for our adults, promote SEL for our students, and practice continuous improvement. So I believe I have this up. You do have to sign up when you get on to look at the measurements of on CASEL's site for the SEL assessment guide. It will just ask for like an email and your role, but then you can log in and get the access to it. So it's really helpful. It's just you follow step by step. You can use pre-K to 12, so you can use in your secondary settings. And it is all about helping those who make decisions and select measures of SEL. So you can see kind of getting prepared to assess, selecting the different assessment options, review your assessment options in your catalog, use your data. So you can find that right on the CASEL website. Okay. Okay, and then measuring student competencies, we just highlighted what that looks like on the site. Prepare to assess, select an assessment, and then use the assessment data. So just some critical practices throughout the SEL roadmap. There are different activities. So as we think about critical practice 1, take time to cultivate and deepen relationships, build partnerships, and plan for SEL. Critical practice 2 is designing opportunities where adults can connect, as well as heal and build their capacity to support students. We want to create safe, supportive, and equitable learning environments. And that, as you can see, really connects back to our efforts in MTSS in Pennsylvania that promote all students' social and emotional development. And practice 4, we keep mentioning data, but our data are important. Use the data as an opportunity to share power, deepen relationships, and use those data for a continuous cycle of improvement for students, family, and staff. So you could consider using these practices as part of a PLC, for example. Right. So I'm briefly going to touch on class-wide practices, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hunter to talk about advanced tiers. So on your Padlet, we can do, and I noticed this comment in the chat earlier, schools often might do PBIS really well at the systems level, and then when we get to the classroom, it's not always applied as well at the classroom level, which is a really good point. We need to ensure that our systems level approaches are also applied day to day in the classroom. It's just part of the way we do business. So some of you may have seen either through PDE's accelerated learning, talking about class-wide intervention. If you've participated in any of our other series, maybe you saw Dr. Matt Burns talk about class-wide intervention for reading and math. It's, helping students when we have a large percentage of students, half or more of the students in a class needing improvement on a skill. So there's just a quick snippet. And this is called class-wide antecedent modifications. People asked, is there a class-wide intervention for behavior? There are some, absolutely. So maybe we're looking at our systems data and we're noticing it's a classroom or two. So how might we intervene at the class-wide level? Common classroom problems. Students might not have learned the behavior, so we might see behavioral problems. We might also see commonly tasks are too difficult. Maybe we're giving students fluency building tasks when they are still in an acquisition phase of learning that task. So the tasks are an instructional mismatch and students aren't engaging, so we have academic problems. Common responses, we provide an intervention or modification after the problem behavior occurs, but we're not really getting at the root of the cause of the problem behavior. So just another reminder that academics and behavior are often highly interconnected. Instructional match helps to enhance engagement, while instructional mismatch, we're giving students material that's too difficult, that they haven't quite built fluency with yet, and they're not ready to do that independent work, for example, can result in problem behavior. So there's a routine card and a short video on how to implement class-wide antecedent modifications. But if you look through the routine, you'll notice that it blends some effective practices, for example, from PBIS or behavioral science, and it blends some appropriate and effective practices from academics. So we're really hitting both of those in an integrated way. So we're establishing classroom expectations in positively stated terms, pull in your PBIS. If students don't have the skill to follow that expectation, for example, they're in an acquisition stage of learning at that point, we need to use direct instruction to teach that skill. We need to get that good instructional match. We're providing reinforcement aligned to function, specific contingent verbal praise, for example. If the function is to gain attention, if it's for tangibles, we want to provide tokens, and we want to minimize reinforcement, for example, remove attention for inappropriate behavior. Have a consistent schedule. We need to spend a little time making sure that those task demands are that right instructional match for students' skill level. We can consider the instructional hierarchy. As students are in an acquisition phase, they're slow and inaccurate in responding. So if we give them independent work where they're expected to complete it rather quickly and independently, we're going to get some behaviors because we don't have that right instructional match. It's too difficult. So we want to make sure we have that right match. We want to do things, channel your inner Anita Archer, use that brisk pace with frequent opportunity for student responses, whiteboards, response cards, choral responding. Intersperse easy tasks with more difficult, allow for student choice, use for high interest materials. But we want to use this whenever behavioral concerns such as disruptive behavior or task refusal are occurring class-wide, or when academic task demands are too difficult and result in externalizing acting out behaviors. So there's about a 15 to 20 minute video. It has a math example in it, how you might implement that. You can kind of think of that as, an extra layer when there is a class of students, half or more of the students are experiencing widespread difficulty. Okay, so I'm going to kind of pause here, see if there's any questions on tier 1 data and practices before I turn it over to Dr. Hunter, who will be talking about advanced tiers data and advanced tiers practices. All right. So I'll turn it over to Dr. Hunter. There you go.
Thank you, Dr. Kruger. All right. Well, we are going to spend the remainder of the morning here just discussing some advanced tiers interventions that may be a good fit for your system as you move forward and develop your MTSS. Let me get this set up with the slideshow. All right, so I should be displaying the proper screen right now. If I'm not, someone please let me know.
You're good.
Good to know. So when we're thinking about advanced tiers in our secondary model, we have these all kind of lumped together, right? And if we're thinking about the model of MTSS at the secondary level that we're promoting here in Pennsylvania, we're looking at more of a 2-tiered model. And so for that reason, we didn't really separate out interventions that would be maybe a tier 2 or a tier 3 fit. We just have interventions that would be appropriate for students who need that level of supplemental intervention at the secondary level. And if you're interested in learning a little bit more about that 2-tiered model, we do have a webinar that Dr. Mark Shin did, kind of overviewing that model. It's an integrated academic and behavioral secondary MTSS model. So if you, I know if you've been in the series perhaps before, you may have seen Dr. Shin present on this model. I think your administrators participating this year probably saw that as well. But I just kind of wanted to point that out that because sometimes we do get some confusion as to 3-tiered versus 2-tiered model when we shift to the secondary. And we really are looking at a 2-tiered model where we have students that we're just going to try to support maybe by beefing up our tier 1, as Dr. Kruger talked about. And then we have students that we know need more than what we're offering at tier 1, and we're going to support them through our advanced tiers. Another point here before we get into the content too is like this is really just an overview of the interventions, kind of what they do and how they might benefit students, what type of students may be a good fit for the intervention, etc. You're not going to leave the session today knowing how to go back to your school and necessarily implement these interventions. We wanted to give you kind of like a menu of options prior to your site visits that you can be thinking about, okay, which of these interventions might fill a need at our school based on those data sources that Dr. Kruger talked about earlier. In looking for those and in knowing your student body, as you're listening to these interventions, think about which ones maybe will fill a need in your school and have a high impact on some of the students and some of the difficulties you're seeing in your community with students that need support. And then if you want to implement that, we have resources through your local IU or Patton that you can reach out and contact either your local IU or your regional Patton office, and they should be able to set you up with the support to install some of these interventions and give you the additional training and technical assistance needed to get those up and running. All right. So moving forward. So just like we started out with a discussion of data at tier 1, we're going to talk a little bit about advanced tiers data as well, because data is an important foundational component of a multi-tiered system of support. So in the chat, if you just want to let us know, how do we know when our advanced tiers interventions are working for our students? Go ahead and put your thoughts in the chat around that. If you're implementing an advanced tiers intervention, how do you know it's working for your students? Okay. Some ideas around decreases in office discipline referrals. Hopefully you're using your interventions less often. Kelly, I'm assuming you mean like less and less students need them over time, like a smaller percentage of students. Progress monitoring, right? Making sure we have those recommended proportions of students receiving advanced tiers interventions. I like improved academic output. Hopefully the point of intervening is to improve kids' overall school functioning, right? So not just hopefully Are we increasing their social, emotional, and behavioral competencies? Hopefully that results in some kind of generalized improvement in their ability to participate in school and be engaged as a student. Right. Hopefully we're solving some issues so that our interventions are supporting students and no longer needing that support. All right, increased engagement. All right, and grades increase. Yes. So those are some good ways that we may know that our advanced tiers interventions are working. Which brings us to some things about data as we look at an MTSS. So as we move throughout the tiers of MTSS, we're increasing with intensity. And here's our secondary MTSS infographic that illustrates that kind of two-tiered model we were talking about. And you can see here where we have that in the triangle, there's a blend of students who maybe are in our most intensive and maybe are in somewhat at-risk areas that are receiving that advanced tier support. While as in our core support, we have a blend of students who are kind of just need core only versus some students who maybe need a little additional support. But all around, determining who needs what type of support is data, right? And practices. And as we go across the tiers or up the tiers, so to speak, as we're moving from our core, our tier 1 into our advanced tiers support, we're increasing not only in intervention intensity, we're increasing in measurement intensity and measurement frequency. So thinking about some things that we're going to need at the advanced tiers in terms of data, one thing that came across in the chat and the responses is progress monitoring data, right? So when we're looking at tier 1 data analysis and looking at office discipline referrals or early warning systems, we may look at that data on a monthly basis. We may look at it periodically, quarterly, whatever frequency that your school is looking at that. Sometimes at the secondary level with academic screenings, we may only look at an end of the year assessment. We may look at things 3 times a year, et cetera, like that fall, winter, spring kind of benchmarking assessment. When we get to the advanced tiers, we're going to be progress monitoring students weekly or biweekly or daily, even with some of the behavior interventions that we talk about. And many of the interventions do kind of come with progress monitoring built into them. So check in, check out has its own system of progress monitoring that's kind of already there with the intervention. Check and Connect also has a progress monitoring system that's built into that intervention as well. And then if you're doing more individualized function-based interventions, obviously that's going to be a pretty intensive data collection process right there. We may need some more diagnostic assessment about students too. Our screening data may not be enough to adequately inform what the cause of this student's problem is to help us get that good intervention match, right? So if we know that we screen some students and maybe we want to do some social academic instructional groups, we kind of need to know what that student's need is so that we can get them in the right type of group. So there may be some additional data collection that we need to get students matched to the right type of intervention. Some other things that we need to consider too at the advanced tiers are data decision rules, right? We need to know what type of data suggests that student A perhaps is more appropriate for this intervention than this other type of intervention, right? How do we know that when a student is appropriate for an advanced tier intervention? Okay, considering that these are limited resources that can't be provided to every student, we need to make sure that we have some sort of consistent decision-making process for what students access what type of interventions. Additionally, once they're in the intervention, it also helps to have some rules to guide how do we know if the intervention is working. So we are collecting all this progress monitoring data, but we kind of have to have some kind of criteria that says what is success in this intervention. And then also too, when is the intervention successful enough that maybe we can fade it and move on to less intensive supports? And how do we know if the interventions may be unsuccessful to the point where we need to consider more intensive supports or other interventions? So having some data decision rules developed ahead of time is really going to help your team efficiently identify students for the appropriate advanced tiers interventions, right? And also have efficient meetings to review progress and determine, okay, which students are successful and we're going to maintain this support. Which students are we ready to start fading supports and see if they can't generalize this and do it on their own? And which students do we need to make some different decisions about because this intervention just doesn't seem to be working? So having that kind of hashed out a little bit ahead of time with some objectivity can make your data meetings a little bit more efficient and less nebulous. Okay. Another thing to look at too is how many students are responding to your interventions. Okay. Ideally, if we have an effective advanced tier intervention that's being implemented with fidelity, we should see good number of students responding to that intervention. Okay. So one way to do that is to kind of look at your interventions by, all right, how many students do we have in this intervention? What number of students are meeting the success criteria or meeting their goal for that intervention, and determine the percentage of students who are successful in that intervention. I'm not aware necessarily, I think check in, check out, there are some numbers around the percentage of students that should respond to that. Some of your other interventions, I don't know that there's like concrete numbers, but hopefully you're seeing like the majority of students that are in these interventions are showing a positive response and meeting some kind of success criteria there. If not, you can see on the screen here, we have fidelity measure, like, are you measuring fidelity and is fidelity adequate? You know, if your intervention doesn't seem to be working for many of the kids that are in it, the first thing I would check is fidelity. And if fidelity is in place and your intervention still isn't working again, then you may have to go back to your intervention selection criteria. Is, do we have this student matched to A, the right type of intervention, and B, the intervention that has the appropriate amount of intensity for this student as well. So this is also a good way to just overall check the health and strength of your advanced tier support by looking at the percentage of students that are responding to your interventions. It's also a good screening tool then to have individual discussions about students who aren't responsive, which can be real time saving when you're doing your data teaming. So instead of going through and looking at each student's data individually in that meeting, have a data analyst kind of analyze that data ahead of time. Based on your data decision rules that we talked about, you should be able to identify students who are responding adequately and those who aren't. And once you've kind of looked at that overall indicator health of the intervention, move right into problem solving around students who perhaps aren't responding to the intervention. Knowing that students who are showing a positive response, probably we can just continue and check in on them at a later date when we're ready to fade that intervention. And hopefully our school-based behavioral health providers would be members of a team that would not only look at data and help match students to interventions, but also probably be a part of an advanced tiers team where you're monitoring the implementation of interventions and the success of those interventions. So hopefully that's a role that you're filling as a school-based behavioral health provider, and if not, making some plans with your administrator on how you can expand your role into including some of those duties and functions. So one of the first advanced tier interventions we're going to talk about is check-in, check-out. I saw that we have a lot of schools implementing PBIS on the call today. So this is check-in and check-out and PBIS kind of go hand in hand, because this is one of the most probably frequently used and researched advanced tier interventions within a PBIS system. So again, like I said, check-in, check-out is widely implemented, typically at tier 2 and the lower and like the elementary grades. Again, at the secondary level, we're not saying this is for students who are at tier 2 or not. This is a student that, this would be for a student that's in need of advanced tier intervention. And your team would look at the data and the intensity and the needs of the student to see if this is maybe the appropriate intervention for a student or part of an appropriate intervention package for a student as well. Generally, this is for students who aren't responding to those universal preventative methods that your MTSS has set up. So your cell programming, your expectations, and your general contingencies that are offered to all students. We're still seeing some students, as Dr. Kruger talked about, maybe by looking at discipline referrals or behavior screeners, trying to catch those students early to prevent more problematic behaviors as the year goes on. So check-in, check-out is based on contingency management. And the foundational principle, is that it provides students with more frequent and structured access to positive consequences contingent upon the demonstration of desired behaviors. How frequently can check-in, check-out be used during a day? So when you do, Kim, we're going to look at a sample check-in, check-out card here in a moment as part of the discussion, and we can talk about the frequency of that feedback at that time. And I believe, yeah, we'll talk about that in a moment. Okay, so why does it work? We're increasing positive adult interactions. We are also adding increased structure throughout the student's day. We're providing them with increased instruction and practice and self-monitoring. We're getting increased contingent feedback regarding desired behavior. Okay, so as the student shows desired behavior, we're increasing the amount of positive feedback and reinforcement that they're getting throughout the day for showing us those appropriate and desired behaviors. There is an element of check-in, check-out that links home and school support, right? So we have a daily progress report, progress card that we use with check-in, check-out to provide that increased feedback and structure for the student. We also send that home so that the parent can see how the student's doing. They can initial on that, and they can kind of reinforce, again, more positive feedback and contingent reinforcement for the student based on showing those desired behaviors. One thing with check-in, check-out is in its original form, check-in, check-out does seem to work best for students that have problem behavior maintained by adult attention. Because again, if we're thinking about the main component of this intervention, it's increased interactions with an adult and that adult providing positive feedback about behavior throughout the day, okay? So in this form, check-in, check-out does work better for students who have a maintaining function of adult attention for their behavior. That being said, I know there is an adaptation of check-in, check-out called breaks or better. And that incorporates a system of break cards into the check-in, check-out intervention. And that slight modification can make check-in, check-out more effective for students who maybe have escape maintained behaviors. So thinking at the secondary level and some of those behavior problems that you were kind of listing in the chat, we probably do have a lot of students who the function of their behavior is to escape academic demands. So the breaks or better adaptation of check-in, check-out may be a good fit for those students versus students who have behavior that's maintained by adult attention. And we're going to touch on FBAs and just function-based thinking in general a little bit later on, and maybe we can link that back to how you can use just function-based thinking and brief function assessments to help match kids to the right intervention ahead of time, as opposed to kind of waiting to do an FBA until problems are very significant. All right, so some of the outcomes of check-in, check-out, a lot of research on this one. So it has shown significant decreases in problematic behavior. It has been shown to decrease off-task behavior. It has been shown to decrease office discipline referrals and improve some academic skills. And in general, it has high ratings of social validity, which means that the people implementing the intervention see it as a useful and valuable tool to address the problems that they're dealing with. So some of the basic check-in, check-out procedures are each day, the staff person assigned to that student is going to begin the day with that student with a positive contact, and they're going to provide a brief positive welcome to class. And they're also going to provide a review of some of the expectations and the areas of behavior that the student's working on, maybe some practice, some modeling, etc., around desired and appropriate behavior related to your school-wide expectations. So this all ties back to the tier 1 stuff that hopefully you have in place before you begin to implement some of these practices. Additionally, the staff is going to check in and provide that rated feedback to the student at the end of designated periods throughout the day. So what do students do? Students have the daily check-in, check-out card. They establish goals, and they use the card throughout the day as a prompt and reminder of those desired behaviors. They can also use it as a self-assessment tool, and they're going to get rated teacher feedback again at the end of those specified periods based on how they performed the desired behaviors during that period. And then what do families do? So again, at the end of each day, that parent and caregiver should be asking that student for their daily progress report, the card from the check-in, check-out intervention. They should, sign it and engage the child in a discussion about their day. we're not asking the parents to give corrective feedback again, but just simply kind of making sure that the student's aware that they are interested in and want to see the student do well with the intervention, and having a conversation perhaps about the school day and things that went well, possibly things that need to be improved on. So this is an example of a card that you could use at the secondary level. So again, when we're doing check-in, check-out, the areas relate back directly to your school-wide expectations, okay? So I think our formatting got a little bit off here, but you can see that there's along the side, you have the number of periods that the child is being rated. So Kim, and back to your question, you can kind of set this based on your schedule. Generally, they recommend that this is kind of standard for efficiency reasons. So, right, so each student is getting rated kind of the same amount of times a day that's on check-in, check-out. You can certainly tie it back to your schedule. If you have 4, 5, 6 or so class periods, the easy thing to do would be to provide a rating after each period. Thinking about a secondary school where you're probably going to be going through a schedule and having a different teacher for each class period. You know, you can just set that up, however many periods is in your day, that can be the standard number of periods that you use to provide feedback throughout the day. That being said, if a student needs more feedback than that, then this probably isn't the right level of intensity of intervention for a student. And I believe in the Swiss check-in, check-out training, they say if you need more than like 8, I believe, periods a day to provide feedback for a student, and 8's getting a little high. If that child needs more feedback than that to be successful, then they probably need a more individualized approach than check-in, check-out. Because check-in, check-out is designed to be a group intervention, right? It's not meant to be super individualized. It's meant to be a more efficient intervention that's available to students than an individual one where you're going through function-based assessment and developing an individual positive behavior support plan. So if a student needs something that individualized and that frequent of feedback, you may want to go that route, check-in, check-out, maybe for lower level levels of disruptive behavior and students that can get by with less contingencies and feedback throughout the day. So then you also, again, like I said, so you have the class periods here, and then here you are tying this back to your school-wide expectations. So at the end of each class period, they're going to be rated on how well they demonstrated whatever your definitions are for your school-wide expectations. So how did they do with perseverance during first period? How did they do with respect, 0, 1, or 2, integrity, discipline, etc. If you have some very specific behaviors that you're targeting students under each one of these areas, you can certainly be very explicit about that on your card as well. And perhaps for perseverance, it is that the student is going to complete their assigned tasks by the end of class or something of that nature that you're working on that relates back to your matrix. And you can specifically put that on the card and rate the student based on that specific behavior as well. And again, the cards are a little bit customizable. If you're using Swiss's check-in, check-out, you have a little bit less leeway with how you can modify the cards to make it compatible with that system. If you're not using Swiss, then you can kind of, you have a little less restrictions in how you design the cards and what goes on there. All right, it's got some things in the chat here. Erica, is that the link for Breaks Are Better that you put in the chat?
Yes, and I also put it under advanced tiers in the Padlet, the NCII review on it.
All right, thank you very much. All right, next thing we're going to talk about are social academic instructional groups. So these are groups that are designed to teach skills. And there could be a variety of skills that we would want to teach our students related to behavior. We could be looking at pro-social skills, okay? We could be looking at maybe problem-solving skills. We could be looking at study skills or executive skills. We could be looking at self-regulation skills, coping skills, thinking about those different areas. that kind of Castle identified, plus some direct instruction, maybe in some study skills and organizational skills as well, might be some things that would make up the menu of small groups that you may offer to students as part of your MTSS. So when we're thinking about these groups, they can run from basic to more kind of complex. And if you look at kind of the graphic we have on here, on the basic side, we have things that would typically be provided in the classroom setting and maybe managed by instructional staff, right? Because it doesn't necessarily take a high level of technical skills to run or deliver or implement these groups, right? So hopefully if you're offering small groups in this format, they're tying back to some type of universal cell instruction and programming that you have at your building, right? So to do this well, you should have some type of core programming and core skills that are being taught to all students, right? And that would be something that would be managed within the regular classroom as part of like typical teaching duties. You could also maybe have a small group that's taught inside the classroom weekly by possibly a teacher or support teacher. You could be looking at implementing some strategies, some low-level strategies in class to support behavior management as well. Those might be more towards your basic side of things. Moving further to the right, you can see maybe we're gonna pull some pro-social skills from our core cell curriculum and teach them outside the classroom a couple of times a week from students who are demonstrating that maybe they need some support in those specific skills. And again, because this is our core cell curriculum, we're just kind of pulling students and giving them kind of like a reteach in a small group setting, similar to what we might do for students who have an academic difficulty, right? We might pull them into a small group and give them an extra repetition of the content with increased practice and feedback. We can do the same thing for our core cell curriculum as well. So these, again, can be taught by a range of staff, including staff that are your instructional staff. Again, at this point, we're not getting into the range of anything that would require maybe some kind of specialized expertise. We're just taking what we've already broadcasted to all students, and we're just going to give it to students in a smaller group setting a couple extra times maybe than the rest of the students are receiving that. Moving further to the side, we might be adding some things that are taught by staff with some technical skills, right? We may be still pulling and hopefully tying back to our core cell curriculum, but maybe we're adding some more emotional regulation features. We're having it be taught by our staff that have some background maybe in mental and behavioral health and delivering small group interventions, okay? And again, you could do this inside or outside the classroom, and you are increasing, again, the frequency that they're getting that, right? We're gonna add more than that basic broadcast to all students. We're gonna give them some additional repetitions, maybe 2-3 times a week in that small group setting. And then kind of furthest to the right with our groups, we're getting into some interventions that are probably going to be taught by staff that have advanced skills in this areas, thinking maybe school psychologists, school social workers, home school visitors, school counselors could be good candidates for delivering these groups as well. These are probably going to be more frequent. We may do something daily or a little more intensive than what we're offering to the left of the continuum. And we're probably going to use here I might pull in some additional manualized programs that have good evidence base for the problem that you're dealing with. So the example on here has coping power. That's more of an elementary example. We're going to cover some secondary examples of these programs as part of what we're covering today. But in this example specifically, you'd be looking at maybe doing a small group on some kind of anger management and aggression, taught by some of your behavioral health staff, and you're going to do that outside of the classroom, and you're going to do that at a pretty high frequency, trying to correct some of those skills with these students. So again, looking at having a continuum of intensity, also focusing on a continuum of skills, and provided by a continuum of staff, right? And locations and frequency can vary as well. All right, and so part of this is going to need to be some data analysis, right? Like, how are you going to determine what groups you need to install and which students are you going to put into each group? So this, again, ties back to the importance of data at tier 1 and tier 2. What are our data telling us about students' needs? So we have a group of students that are showing up on our early warning system or showing up on our office discipline referrals as needing some additional support. Then we kind of have to figure out, all right, what type of skill instruction might those students benefit from? What skills are we going to teach? You can see generally at this level, we're looking at either having some kind of pro-social or coping skills, some problem solving skills groups, academic behavior skills groups, thinking like organization, study skills, could be note-taking behavior, et cetera there. Those are some examples of some skills you may want to target in some of these groups. Your options of providers, again, you have teachers that hopefully can provide some of the lower level, less technical groups. Again, things that are going to tie back to your core cell curriculum too would be good things to maybe have teachers and other kind of instructional staff support with. You obviously have your school-based behavioral health staff, and then you can also partner with community-based clinicians as well to provide some of these services as well. So maybe you want to bring in a community partner to provide some type of technical group around substance abuse based on your PAYS data. That's certainly something you can do as well. Locations and frequencies can vary as well. And then the other thing to look at is structure too. Are you going to have standing groups that you offer all year and kind of rotate students through as they demonstrate a need? So I think like an academic behavior skills group around like study skills and organizational skills may be a good idea of a standing group to have available all year. And kind of you can put students in that. It's always offered. As you get referrals, you can kind of fill those seats. Or you can have a build a group. That's where you would be looking at, okay, we've got these couple of students and it looks like they have this specific need. So we're just going to pull together a group around some pro-social coping skills for these 5 students based on the referral data, the teacher feedback, and some information we gathered from counselors, parents, et cetera. So having the flexibility in your system to have some standing groups that you know you're going to have needs and are going to need to be filled is probably a good idea. You want to base that on your local data and what your context is saying your students need most frequently, but also having the flexibility to build in some other groups around some areas that you may not need all the time, but you can have, you can fill them as students show that they need that based on their data. Okay, any recommendations for tier 2 interventions for small groups that have a way to measure success criteria that is built in?
I'm going to post in the chat the Midwest PBIS resources on SAI groups.
That'd be great.
And I'll link it to the Padlet as well.
Aaron, I'm not quite fully understanding your question. Would you like, you can unmute if you want, or if you want to type in a clarification. I'm just not quite sure exactly how to answer that.
Hi, Drew. Yeah, so I was thinking of like different programs, curriculums, that counselors want to use, but they're also trying to find a way to measure like success criteria,
Okay.
like for their entrance criteria and their exit criteria. So they're just, my buildings have been looking for that and we've been kind of exploring. So I was just wondering if you had any more recommendations.
Yeah. So I know a lot of like the CBT manualized group stuff, they encourage the use of like some like behavior rating scales kind of pre and post as a way of measuring progress there. As for determining who goes into groups, again, you could be looking at some your screening data. If you look at the SABRs, there's different areas on there. I think the SRSSIE will also give you like an indication if it's an internalizing, externalizing, to give you a little bit of a guided kind of location by that. You could look at the type of discipline referrals students are getting. You could talk to teachers and see kind of what skills they may need. I guess in matching students to the right group, I'm not sure that there's a one kind of measure that you would be able to pull that from, if you know what I mean. You probably have to pull from a variety of sources. I think as for progress monitoring and success criteria in the interventions, I know Dr. Kruger and myself, we like direct behavior rating. And we like that because it's got good evidence base behind it. We've got some known technical adequacy about the reliability, validity of direct behavior rating. and it's really efficient and fast to complete. And what it really, I think, gets at that maybe, you know, when you're in session and you're measuring skills, like, can they give you the steps to the problem solving process that you've taught them? Yep. Can they do hypothetical situations with this problem solving process, right? But then how do we know that they're using it when we want them to, kind of in the classrooms? And I think that's kind of where DBR is just like a really quick, efficient, and flexible way to see if our students are applying some of the skills we're teaching in a generalized fashion in the classroom and improving. So we can probably throw some direct behavior rating resources up on. Are you familiar with direct behavior rating, Erin, at all?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I would use. And I think you could probably even design some yourself that maybe you could use as kind of an estimate of behavior to see if students are appropriate for certain groups as well, since you can use kind of the big three, right? Like the GOMs of behavior that go with that, or you can design more specific kind of anchors to rate those skills on. So is there anything I know Dr. Kruger is our resident expert on direct behavior rating. I know we have the Sandy Shafolius presentation that she did back, I want to say in 2020, the spring of 2020. Sandy Shafolius did a whole day on direct behavior rating. But Dr. Kruger, is there anything you wanted to add in regards to using DBR for group?
Yeah, I posted it in the chat. So people, and I'm also uploading these things to Padlet. We do have a patent pod, and I just will encourage everyone. I highlighted the UConn simple strategies anyone can use. Dr. Shafolius is primary author on that, but she's also primary researcher on DBR. So I'll put her patent pod and her the link to the website, but you can do the training. It's pretty easy to use. And I will tell you, working at the middle and high school level myself, high school teachers had no problem doing direct behavior rating compared to some of the other things I would give them as a school psychologist to complete, to see how skills were generalizing into the classroom. You can even have high school students do their own version of direct behavior rating as self-monitoring. But the DBR website is all free, and you can watch little videos and just kind of read about it, but you can actually do the training yourself for free on the DBR website on how to use. Single item scale is the one I like for these kind of purposes, but I'll upload it on the Padlet here as well under advanced tiers.
I know, like I said, I know rating scales tend to be kind of what's mainly associated with these, but I think when you get into an MTSS and thinking about assessment efficiency, depending on how many of these groups you're running and how many students, trying to complete that many rating scales may get a little unwieldy. And the DBR, I think, is just a really nice solution for MTSS behavior progress monitoring that really gets at that kind of, is it reliable and valid? Yes. Is it efficient? Yes. And it's got both of those things, and it's repeatable. You can use it multiple times a day. You could have a DBR for every period that student's in, and it would be very, again, just very quick, efficient, and brief graphable data. So, all right, back to this. So again, these are not necessarily therapeutic groups. We do think, and I'm going to talk about therapeutic groups in a moment, because there is a place for those, I think, in our MTSS, but this is not necessarily that. We're looking at pro-social skills, problem-solving skills, and again, those academic behavior skills here. Okay, so these are things that lots of staff with some training and support can deliver these types of supports. It doesn't just have to be an advanced level clinician with some training and supervision in counseling skills. So that gets at what I had just said. They're not therapeutic or diagnostic. Pairing maybe people who have experience with group delivery with your less experienced people as you're building this out may be a good way to help build up some skills too, and kind of expand the continuum of people who can kind of deliver these supports in your building. Yep, daily progress report is similar to the check-in, check-out card. So that would be another one, Erin, you could use. You could develop a daily progress report that kind of matches your groups as well, in addition to the DBR. So if you were working on organization and study skills, you could just develop a little bit of a check card around, was he prepared for class with pencils, needed materials, are physical spaces organized, et cetera, whatever you're targeting in that group, and you can have the teachers rate that throughout the day as well. So you can use that daily progress report or the DBR for these. And again, try to have some sort of flexibility in your group where students can enter, within a couple of days of identification. So those maybe are those standing groups versus those build a group kind of approaches. All right, so again, here, just a specific example, thinking about all these things. In this particular example, the middle school identified that many youth in their building struggle with skills related to executive function. Some students regularly need extra support around skills related to academic organization and study skills. So in this example, the special education teacher pulled together 8 lessons that'll teach specific skills around academic behaviors, organization of the locker, bringing materials to class, et cetera. It's going to be taught on Mondays during lunch by a paraprofessional in the math lab, and hopefully they developed either a daily progress report or a DBR to monitor how well students are progressing with those skills in the general classroom setting. All right, so again, as we had talked about, those social academic instruction groups are not necessarily therapeutic in nature. That being said, as you expand your MTSS, you know that we have many students, if we're thinking back to the statistics that we started this session with, lots of students are struggling and do need something a little bit more therapeutic in terms of their group intervention. So fortunately, I think there are some good tools out there that are already developed. And if you look at kind of, again, CBT manualized approaches, they have some resources for some of these things as well. So the CAT project is a good one for anxiety in adolescence. That is, those of you familiar with Coping CAT, this is essentially an upward extension of that, where the materials and the sessions have just been modified to be more developmentally appropriate for adolescents. That's a good one. I use that one a lot in schools, like that one a lot. For anger and aggression at the secondary level, there is aggression replacement training. That one's been around for a while. That one does have a lot of material in it. So if you're going to deliver that at full fidelity with every session, you're going to have to plan for how you're going to fit that in, because again, there are a lot of sessions in that one. And then a few students who have needs around depression, there's the coping with depression. That one that used to be free. I know I got that free download from the internet. And that's a good one for students who are struggling with depression. And then trauma. So these are some manualized kind of supports for trauma. The support for students exposed to trauma is actually one adapted for school. It's an adaptation of the CBITS intervention that can be delivered more by teachers and instructional staff. So they've adapted that intervention so it's more appropriate delivery at like a classroom level. So it basically, I think they just took out kind of the individual sessions around the trauma narrative and just focus a lot on like the coping skills and the psychoeducation and that stuff. And then you have Bounce Back and CBITS, the cognitive behavior intervention for trauma in schools. Those are group-based manualized approaches for students that are struggling with symptoms related to trauma. And again, those two, Bounce Back and CBITS, are designed for people who have training and experience in delivering therapeutic interventions. So those would be more for specialized staff that would be implementing those. With all these manualized programs too, you can do them as a group, or they can also be a guide. Sorry, go ahead. You can do them as a group, or again, you can use them as a guide for individual counseling that maybe you determine students might need as well. So as part of your MTSS and/or programming for special education, if you provide individual counseling, these programs can do double duty, right? You can use them for a group, or you can use them at the individual level as well. A couple comments in the chat here. All right, so we're going to next talk about Check and Connect. So Check and Connect is a structured mentoring intervention. So it's not, I know when we think we have a lot of schools use mentoring programs in general, this one is structured as there is some specific training that you should have your mentors receive before you start implementing this as to what the role of the Check and Connect mentor is, because there are some specific duties that the mentor performs in this intervention in order to do it with fidelity. So it's not scripted, but it is structured. Check and Connect is focused on school engagement. And by school engagement, we're talking about broad engagement. We're not talking about a child sitting at a desk paying attention like we might think of when your school psychologist does that structured observation as part of their evaluation process, right? We're talking about overall cognitive, affective, behavioral, and academic engagement with school. And this is kind of based on the idea that students that see themselves as being successful at school, see them as being a part of school, students that have relationships at school, that forms this idea of engagement. And when students are engaged with school, they tend to come at school and be more successful in terms of with their academics, following the social, emotional, and behavioral norms of the school, and just generally seeing themselves as part of a school community, and that school is something valuable and relevant to their lives and future. So Check and Connect is focused on fostering that sense of engagement in students. And it also has a focus on school completion. So this is really good for secondary schools, particularly if you have students of any population or demographic that struggle with completing school in general or completing high school on time. So there's a lot of good empirical support for Check and Connect. It was initially developed as part of a 5-year grant and collaboration between the University of Minnesota and the Minneapolis Public Schools. If you go on What Works Clearinghouse, this is the only intervention that has showed positive effects for staying in school. And additional research has shown that it has positive effects for increasing students with attendance problems as young as 6th grade as well. So I know we have some probably middle school, junior high schools on here. There is evidence to support that Check and Connect is an effective intervention at the middle school level as well. And in fact, we know from research that that kind of dropout risk and school disengagement really does start as early as 6th grade. So having this available as one of your continuum of interventions, even at a junior high school, can help support students who are disengaging from school and becoming at risk for dropping out. So Check and Connect has 4 components to it. There's 4 main components. These are some of the core components. It has the mentor, which is the individual that is going to work with the at-risk student. Now, there is a bit of a time commitment for Check and Connect mentors. They do recommend that you make a 2-year commitment to working with the student, right? This is not a several-week intervention or something where we want to be swapping adults in and out. We're looking at having a stable adult mentor in the life of the student, supporting the student for approximately 2 years, maybe more. Okay. There is the check component of the intervention. And this component of the intervention is where the mentor uses data that aligns to your early warning system to check how the student is doing in relation to their grades and coursework, their attendance, and their behavior at school. Then there's the connect component of the intervention. And this is where the mentor works with the student in kind of using that check data to connect the student with interventions that are going to support their specific needs. So if the mentor is looking at their check data, typically they'll do this with the student and they'll have conversations with the student and they'll do some problem solving with the student around what's going on in their check data. So if their check data shows that they've been late to school or missing school, the mentor is going to talk about that with the student, try to identify what the barriers are with the student for them getting to school and getting to school on time. And also just kind of engaging and reinforcing the idea that being at school is important so that you can get your work done, so that you can get your grades, so that you can have options, you know, post high school, et cetera. But then based on also that conversation that mentor is having with that student, they're going to try to connect that student with resources in your school and or community if need be around supporting that student with their attendance concerns. So if there's a transportation issue that the mentor becomes aware of as part of this check and connect process, they're going to try to work with family, community, and school resources to address the issue of the transportation issue that is possibly preventing that student from getting to school. Right. There is a family engagement component to check and connect. The mentors also maintain contact with the family. Again, trying to work with the family to support the student in engaging at school, and also working with the family, again, to identify barriers that the mentor can then use to connect the student and child to resources to kind of reduce those barriers to successful school engagement. And then, as with any, fidelity of implementation is important with check and connect. Like I said, it's not scripted, but it is structured. There are steps and data that are used as part of this intervention. The check and the connect process need to be occurring, as well as some of the other components to do check and connect well and with fidelity. Erica, you were going to discuss Renew, correct?
Yes. So I'll talk briefly about Renew, and I believe Dr. Silke Caparelli is on the call, who's our statewide lead and oversees the Renew work in Pennsylvania. So please feel free to jump in, Silke. But Renew is a structured school to career transition planning and individualized wraparound process for youth with emotional and behavioral challenges. It was developed in 1996 by the staff at the Institute on Disability. And it's being provided to schools across Pennsylvania via Renew TOTs, TOTs, or training, people who went through the training of trainers situated in intermediate units. So I was one of those Renew trainers when I was at the intermediate unit. It is a pretty intensive process. It focuses on supporting each youth to help design and pursue a plan for transition from school to adult life. It has been shown to substantially increase high school completion, employment, and post-secondary education participation rates among our most vulnerable youth. So if you remember earlier, we looked at the ABC data. The ABC data can be very helpful in determining which students are off track for graduation and who might be good candidates for Renew. It is a really neat process that involves mapping. One of the differences with Renew and some other programs is that Renew, the student picks their team. So that is, that is youth empowerment at its best. But if you want to click to the next slide, I'll talk about the 4-phase process. So you can visit the Renew website. I have that linked on the Padlet for you. But the first phase is engagement of the youth and helping them in their futures planning. So they're guided by a Renew facilitator. So your intermediate units should have someone who is trained in Renew to be able to do some training at the building level and train some facilitators. But youth have a facilitator who move the student through these 4 phases. And they work through that mapping process. It's person-centered. There's 9 maps that ultimately help inform that selection of the youth team, as well as inform the development of the youth action plan. All is guided by the youth, as self-determination is a core component of Renew. And it is implemented, and the youth is supported and celebrated with each accomplishment. So if you've been through the Renew training, you know that celebrations, reaching those, even those smallest milestones on the action plan, are to be celebrated throughout the way. So if you want to learn any more, reach out to your local IU to connect with a Renew trainer, or contact Patton directly. Silke, again, is our lead for the state. Out of our Harrisburg office, Karen Deary is our Renew person. And is it Donna Halpin out of the East?
Not sure. Get some
Okay.
confirmation around that.
Okay, thank you, Tina. Dr. Kristen Starosta is the Renew lead out of the Eastern office. So there's a lead in each Patton office and then your intermediate unit. So start with your intermediate unit. if they don't have a Renew facilitator or trainer to train facilitators, reach out to Patton, and your Patton lead on that can help you with it. But it is really interesting to see all of the maps and look at the student data, improving attendance or improving grades, for example, reducing discipline referrals across the implementation of Renew.
Thank you, Dr. Career.
Okay, yep, thank you.
All right. I think we're going to discuss functional behavior assessment and positive behavior support plans now. I believe this is the last advanced tier intervention we're going to be covering, and then we'll probably have some time for some Q&A after that. So I know we have a lot of school psychs on the call and school counselors, so we probably have a lot of people familiar with FBA, but if you're not, functional behavioral assessment is the systematic and formal use of evaluation to identify the functions of behavior. Simply put, it is a process for understanding the variables that contribute to the occurrence of interfering behaviors. And that's from Mark Steege, who has a really nice resource on conducting school-based functional behavior assessments. I'm a big fan of his work. Also, function-based intervention plans are going to be an effective method for eliminating behavior of concern, but also developing positive, proactive behaviors at the same time and increasing academic achievement. And there's just tons of research around the effectiveness of positive behavior support plans based on functional behavior assessments. So why should we be doing FBAs? In addition to the reasons that we just said about the effectiveness of these particular methods at not just reducing problem behaviors, but giving students pro-social and adaptive alternative behaviors to engage in, when you base a positive behavior support plan on function, as in the type of reinforcement that's maintaining the behavior or what the individual is getting out of it, you're going to be more effective because you're getting at the root cause of the behavior and why the student is engaging in it. So typically what we see when we're not using function-based is we'll throw an intervention in place, again, based on what the behavior looks like or the topography. Or we'll use it based on practitioner preference, right? Like the teacher or the individual who's kind of delivering the intervention has an intervention that they like to use, right? And they've been using that and they're just comfortable doing that. The problem is when we don't consider behavior, not only are our plans are usually ineffective, but if they're not, we're usually having to rely on some pretty artificial reinforcement and intrusive punishment to get those types of interventions to work, because we're not addressing one, the type of reinforcement that the student's after when engaging in the behavior, and two, we're not addressing the naturally occurring source of that reinforcement that's in the environment. So as a result of that, we have to engineer these really these behavior plans that have, again, this like artificial reinforcement and maybe getting into punishment procedures, which we really don't want to be doing to get those plans to be effective. So that's why FBAs are important, right? It's kind of like the working smarter as opposed to working harder kind of mantra. And it's going to make the behavior plans more efficient and hopefully less aversive for the students as well. All right, some other things to know though is based on some research and some practical experience, most youths don't get FBA BIP until way too late, right? Thinking at when I was in the secondary level, if we were doing FBA BIP on a student, it was usually because there was a manifestation determination, right? And at that point, we're at a high risk for a placement change. And those of you, again, that work at the secondary level know that even though those placements are only necessarily meant to be for 45 days or so, many students go to those placements and don't return to their neighborhood schools. And the outcomes of students from those placements are not exactly positive either. So if at all possible, we want to get access to those FBA BIP interventions sooner so that we can keep students in their community school. All right. Another problem with FBA BIPs is like many times they're conducted, but they're kind of not used then or appropriately used or well matched to the behavior intervention plan that's developed, right? We conduct the BIP because, you know, we have to check that box on the IEP that says, you know, this student has behaviors that interfere with learning or learning of others. So therefore, then we have to conduct the FBA. We do it, and then we develop a BIP that may or may not be based on the data, and that FBA has been my experience as well, right? So it's often kind of like just almost seen as like a piece of a compliance effort more so than a assessment technique that's really going to drive our intervention plans as well. Okay. And another big problem too is that a lot of behavior intervention plans only focus on rewarding youth for appropriate behavior, or they focus only on consequence strategies, right? Like, what are we going to do after a behavior occurs? And what a good FBA is going to give us is all sorts of information that we can use to hopefully prevent problem behavior from occurring. So we need to get those supports that make the appropriate behavior more likely, like our antecedent strategies. We need to get those into our behavior plans as well, and focus less on what happens and what we're doing after a behavior occurs. And these are all areas that FBA can really help us with. There we go. I think I may have gone too far ahead. I was having some issues. There we go. Okay. So again, when thinking about behavior functions generally fall into two categories. We're either trying to access or obtain something, or escape and avoid something. So positive reinforcement kind of corresponds to that obtaining or getting something, and it could be activities, tangible items, attention from adults or peers, or some kind of sensory stimulation. And similarly, we can seek to escape or avoid those same experiences, unpleasant activities, unpleasant demands, unpleasant social situations. These are all things we might try to escape and then be reinforced by the removal of that aversive stimuli. So then, in addition to this concept of function, which ties back to our consequences here, right? A good FBA is also going to identify our antecedents and our setting events. So our antecedents are those environmental features that trigger the behavior, so to speak. And our setting events are more distal things in the environment that make it more likely that a student is going to engage in problem behavior when presented with those antecedents. So with this full spectrum of information that we should be getting from our functional behavior assessment, we can really focus here on these variables and hopefully omit the inappropriate response and also replace it with a more alternative and appropriate desired response. Again, getting away from just focusing on those consequence strategies and really looking at focusing on teaching appropriate alternative behaviors and modifying the environment to reduce the likelihood of problem behavior in the first place. That clarity on this is not so well. But what you have here is a graph where they compared non-function-based interventions to function-based interventions with a student. Right? So the triangles represent task engagement for this particular student, and the circles represent problem behavior. So in the non-function-based intervention, this was an evidence-based intervention, but it was just pulled from the literature and was not matched to the student's function. You can see that there was very little change in the level of problem behavior and task engagement that this student engaged in. However, when we introduce the function-based intervention, you can very clearly see a result, an improved task engagement and a reduction in problem behavior. Then when we remove that function-based intervention and go back to that non-function-based intervention, you can see that those levels of engagement and problem behavior very quickly return to the baseline levels of intervention. So what this shows us is that obviously function-based interventions are going to be superior to non-function-based interventions. Some additional research here. This was a similar study, but really extended it beyond just this idea of function versus non-function-based behavior to implementing a full spectrum of support based on the FBA data. So in this study, we have our baseline, and then we have the function and the non-function-based phases here. The function-based phase not only includes an intervention based on the maintaining consequences, but also addressed antecedent and setting events. And the non-function-based intervention did not address the full spectrum. It didn't address setting events or antecedents, and it didn't match the intervention to function. So again, what you can see clearly here is that when we have that function-based strategy with those antecedent modifications, we get a sharp improvement of behavior. And when we withdraw those, we return to our baseline levels. And that was repeated several times in this study. So again, just really hammering the home of not only just matching our consequence strategies to functions, but making sure that we're addressing antecedent stimuli and setting events as part of our positive behavior support plans as well. And then I like this graphic because I think, and rightfully so, like a complex FBA is certainly something that we're reserving for students that have our highest level of need, right? From a resource perspective, just like we were talking about the direct behavior rating versus like using behavior rating scales, right? There's not that many people in your building who are trained and competent to do complex FBAs, right? And they're not going to be able to do that for every student that needs advanced tiers intervention. That being said, that doesn't mean that we can't do some function-based thinking or some more brief function-based assessments as part of our MTSS to try to get that good intervention match, right? So there are ways that we can kind of at least be thinking about function, making a hypothesis about function, or doing low-level, briefer forms of functional assessment, perhaps just doing an interview or using something like the problem behavior questionnaire, which is like a rating scale that helps identify functions with students too. So throughout our advanced tiers, ideally, we have a continuum of ways that we're incorporating behavior function into our intervention matching system, right? So even if we're looking at students for check-in, check-out, again, we talked about there being students who are going to be beneficial from the traditional check-in, check-out when they're maintained by adult attention versus students who may have escape behavior, and you may want to use that breaks or better approach. So having a way to at least be hypothesizing about that as you're putting students in interventions is going to help ensure that you get a good intervention match sooner rather than later, right? So even, you know, if you look at your social academic groups, if you have students maybe who are engaging in behaviors to get peer attention, perhaps some type of pro-social skills group where they can learn some skills to engage peers more appropriately would be a good intervention for that student as well. So again, function-based thinking and having kind of a continuum of how you're assessing function throughout the advanced tiers is just going to make your advanced tier supports more efficient and more effective than kind of just matching students without considering that. Again, always knowing that there are going to be students who are going to need that more intensive and complex FBA bit process and making sure that we have people who are trained and competent in that process as well. Yep, even classroom management strategies, we want our teachers to be thinking about function. So the classic example here is students are disruptive and they're being sent out of the room as a consequence when the actual function of that behavior is to escape that class or that work. So we want to have people thinking about behavior function at all levels of our MTSS. This kind of is just illustrates that brief versus complex FBI bit process. So we're looking at the same process in general, whether the behaviors are mild or intense, whether the student has an IEP or not. But as the need of the students increase, the intensity of the process is going to increase. So I may be gathering more data, more different types of data, and looking to do more individualization of a student's intervention plan or intervention package as we get more on the complex side of things. Whereas on the brief side of things, we're looking at lower level needs, gathering less data, fewer settings, perhaps that the behavior is occurring in, having maybe a standing team to work on those with less individualization. Whereas on the complex side, we're looking at more intense and problematic behaviors. We're going to do a more intensive data gathering need. There's going to be more areas of this student's functioning in life that are going to be impacted by this behavior. And we're probably going to be looking at developing a unique team for our behavior intervention plan. You may want to engage the student in the selection of that team so that they have some input on the adults supporting them. And we're being highly individualized on that side of the spectrum as well. So again, having a continuum of assessment intensity. All right, so again, although formal FBA BIP is important, right? And there's obviously a need for that in some of our students identified with special education due to procedural and legal aspects of that, where we're going to need a formal FBA BIP that goes on that IEP document. We think that understanding the ABCs of behavior, that antecedent behavior consequence sequence, is an important tool for all staff in your MTSS at all 3 levels of the tiers, right? Function-based problem solving can exist on a continuum. We can do some informal problem solving at the classroom level based on observations. We can modify tier 2 interventions based on a function, or we can get into very complex BIPs based on very complex FBAs. It's all a continuum. All right. So that kind of concludes the content that we had prepared today. So in thinking about some of the things that we highlighted today, we're going to, if everyone remembers how to access their annotation tool, we're going to give you the option to kind of say which one of these is something you think you'd like to learn more about for your school district. Which area or which intervention, which tier, et cetera. Where is your school in their MTSS journey, and which of these interventions really interest you that you think you'd like to learn more about, possibly implement? I think we got some things coming through in the chat. I no longer have the annotation option. Oh no.
What I was gonna say, do you want to stop share and I'll share?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. Maybe,
It must be a setting that I didn't check. I think you remember when we were sorting it out in the beginning, you would.
all right, can you annotate now? There we go. You would think after a year and a half of doing Zoom.
I don't remember you having to have it set by individual person sharing their screen before. Thought if it was enabled, it was enabled.
And if there is something we didn't put up here, please feel free to post it in the chat.
That looks like a nice even distribution.
Oh, wow. All right. So our intermediate unit TAC, check this out.
All right. Yes, and so as part of those of you that are here with a team that's participating in our secondary series, you should have a site visit scheduled specifically to discuss some behavioral health the cell strand component of the series. Either with myself, Dr. Kruder, I believe Silky Caparelli scheduled those in the West, and Tina Lawson and Donna Halpin, I believe, took care of those in the Eastern region. So at that visit, that's an area to discuss which of these you would like to implement possibly as part of your series. And again, at that time, we can connect you with IU and/or patent resources to implement these. So we have people who are, PBIS network facilitators at your local IU. They would be able to support you with your cell practices as well. Check in, check out those groups. We have renew and check and connect trainers at the IU and the patent level as well. So our hope here, our purpose here with this was to give you a broad overview of some things that you could be working on to kind of develop your MTSS, with the idea that you're going to pick some of these and implement them as part of your participation in the series. If you're here not as participating in the series, you can do the same thing. We'll still work with you. Just reach out to your local IU and see what can be done to implement some of these practices at your district. All right. And that's it. We just talked about that. So it is about 11:40. Are there any final thoughts or questions as we conclude the session? And I can go ahead and get that code up. I also, Karen, is there any announcements that we need to make as part of the secondary